If I were to ask you what the average human life is worth, what would you say? It's a bit of an odd question because we don't think of human life in this way. But the fact is that each and every day, human beings are bought and sold. And some of you may be surprised to find that the average cost of a human being isn't $10,000 or $5,000, but that the global average is $90. And that here in Asia, it's as little as $5. Today, it is easier than it has ever been to buy human life. For $5, someone can be sold to a brothel where they'll be forced to work and service up to 20 clients in a day. Or they'll be sold to a factory, a fishing boat, or someone's home where they'll work for 20 hours without pay, with the threat of violence or death if they protest. This isn't just modern-day slavery. It's the ultimate commodification of human life. And today, there are an estimated 21 million victims of human trafficking worldwide. More than half are said to be from Asia, and the majority of these are young people. There's a story of a young girl that really struck me and changed the way that I thought about this issue. She was a young Vietnamese girl. She was about 14 years old. And she used to borrow her father's bicycle to get to work at a local shoe factory every day. And over time, this young man befriended her. But then one day, out of the blue, he told her that he'd taken her bicycle and that he had sold it. And she was distraught because she knew that this was the most valuable possession that her family owned. But he gave her a solution. He said, all you have to do is come with me to the next town. You'll earn more money than what you're making in the factory now, and you can just buy the bike back. Frightened to go home without the bike, she trusted him, and she went with him. And when she did, and when she arrived in the next town, she was beaten, and she was raped, and she was taken abroad to a brothel where she had to work for 3 years. Human trafficking tears at the values of our societies, not only in the places where we contribute to the demand, but also in the places that are sources for victims. And the thing is, demand isn't isolated. We all consume products that come from this form of exploitation. But I believe that we're in a moment, that here in Southeast Asia in particular, we're in a moment of incredible progress, both economic and social progress. And we have an opportunity to stand up to this challenge. Because while young people, like the girl in Vietnam, are those that are most often targeted because their hopes and dreams for a better life are easy to manipulate, it's also young people, because of these hopes and dreams, that can stand up to the challenge and define themselves as the generation that puts an end to slavery. If you look around you, we're privy to a generation of young people that are driving our societies forward through innovation, technology, and intellect. But all this progress also presents a possibility. It's a possibility for us to redefine how we distribute prosperity and to redefine the values of how we stand up to the challenges that we face as societies. And human trafficking is just one of those challenges. That's a symptom of those challenges. And we have an opportunity now, because small acts of resistance, small acts of courage, and small acts of compassion can create the space that allows voices to be heard. And it's these voices that can start to dictate that this political moment is not defined by one that commodifies human beings. You know, just 48 years ago, my mother, she's actually here with us today, she was in a similar political moment of change in Indonesia. She was making her way to Jakarta so she could board a flight out of all places to Pyongyang, North Korea, to learn textile engineering. I know that sounds crazy, but back then it actually wasn't so far-fetched. But the thing was, her flight was supposed to leave the first week of October 1965. And just a few days before her departure date, an attempted coup triggered a campaign of mass killings that killed over 500,000 people. And this estimate is much, much higher, according to some people. And the targets of this campaign were people that were communists, socialists, or anyone that was accused of being sympathetic. And at that time, my grandfather was a social activist. His brother was a long-standing member of parliament in Indonesia. And both had struggled and fought for Indonesia's self-determination and independence. And both had fought for a more just society after independence. And both were jailed for over a dozen years after the dust settled on the events of 1965, simply because the space for their political ideas and their form of activism disappeared. So I believe that political moments matter, not only because they shape the trajectories of ourselves and our families, because they can and do, but because the moments, like those in 1965, test the very fabric of our society. And human trafficking tears at that fabric. But we don't have to just stand by. So, as you've probably gathered, I work for a campaign that raises awareness about human trafficking. And the way we do that is to share stories. We share the stories of survivors that are courageous enough to share their experience. We share the stories of ordinary people that have taken this cause up and have devoted their lives to it. And we even share the stories of traffickers who tell us of their tales of deception. But one of the hardest things to do is to engage the general public and tell them and encourage them to act. We have social media and technology which allows us to share these stories more easily, with greater impact and with greater reach. But the thing is, despite the fact that social media and technology allows us to engage with people around the world, it allows us to get people to sign up for online petitions and allows us to get people to share stories of human abuses in distant places, there is merit to the argument that sometimes this amounts to little more than a substitute for real action. But I think that argument misses the point, because the importance of these actions is to create the space where voices can be heard. Because these challenges are long-term struggles, and it's this space that allows us to start to create a dialogue where people feel encouraged and empowered to act. And despite the limitations of online activism, I think there's an opportunity to merge online and offline actions in a way that creates lasting social movements. In September last year, in Bandung in Indonesia, I helped organize a concert. And as part of this concert, we handed out 2,000 wristbands that were linked to the social media accounts of those that came to the concert. There were stations throughout the concert where people could swipe these wristbands and it would automatically post a message about trafficking on their online account. And in just 90 minutes, with less than 2,000 wristbands, we reached over 2.5 million people about a social issue they wouldn't have heard of or even cared about before. But this isn't just a bean counting exercise. It's not about the numbers, because the real value came into seeing what people did once they received those messages. Because technology allows us to see what people looked at, what they viewed, and what they shared, we were able to gain insight into what engaged them in the first place. And knowing this and using this as a first step, we were able to engage those people that took action online with young people that were taking action in their local community. And together now, these groups have gone all across Indonesia, and they've gone into local communities to disseminate information about the hotline numbers and the resources that are available in your community. They've gone and done trainings in schools so young people and their peers know about the warning signs of trafficking. And they've created some of the most amazing content that speaks to the issue in locally relevant ways that a global media campaign can't always do. And all of this data and information allows us to link people together. But it also starts to reveal some interesting patterns. We work with some amazing organizations, and they've devoted years and years to going into countries so they can find the trafficking hotspots, the places where people come from that are trafficked. They used to do this with paper surveys. And what they found was the villages, the cities, and the towns where victims of trafficking came from. But with technology and with more and more organizations feeding data into this, some interesting patterns have started to emerge. In one case, there's one province on the border of Thailand that's been long known to be a source for victims that end up in the fishing industry in brothels and in factories across the border. But when all this data came together and people started to look at it a bit more closely, they found an interesting pattern. It turns out that this wasn't an entire province of people, but in fact, it was a set of communities on one road, on one single road that led to the border. And what this kind of information allows us to do is to approach this problem with a scalpel instead of an axe. It allows us to approach the social issues that we face with nuance and with context and with an understanding of what matters in a local place. And this is what technology can really contribute. But alone, it isn't enough. Technology only works when individuals have the courage to act. And we shouldn't underestimate the value and the inspiration that single individual actions can create. There's a story of a 20-year-old Cambodian man that I learned about 2 years ago. And he had ended up on a fishing boat along with 3 of his friends. He was there for 5 years without ever seeing land. But one day, by chance, this boat was forced to dock. And as it happened, he happened to find himself by a TV, and what he saw was a documentary that we'd produced. And when he saw this documentary, he realized that the story he was seeing actually reflected his own. And when a hotline number scrolled across the bottom of the screen, he memorized it. He went back to the boat, and he gathered his 3 friends, and together they pooled together the little money that they had so they could make an international call, the hotline number that he'd memorized. On the other end of that call was a young lady, and she managed, despite 0 police support and 0 support from them to actually act on this issue, she managed to get them to escape. And because the young man had memorized the name of the boat and the registration number of the boat, 6 other men ended up being rescued. And what this story has is elements of chance and of compassion. And I think we have to empower people who are willing to take that chance to talk about this and take an action that might seem impossible. And we have to empower them to allow them to do that. You know, a friend of mine, he once said that small acts of resistance create an invisible crack. They allow us to see possibility where we used to see stasis. And I wonder what this invisible crack would have meant 48 years ago. I don't think that alone it would have changed anything, but just maybe there would have been the possibility for the type of political dialogue my grandfather believed in. And the thing was, after 12 years in prison, and after being in exile, away from the country that he had helped found, away from the country he called home, he wasn't bitter or angry. In fact, the day he died, he was on a bridge in Holland. It's one of those bridges that you might think of when you think of a painting of Europe. And he was on his way to deliver a lecture. And this lecture was a story about hope and the strength of the human spirit. Excuse me. And he believed that no matter what, that could stand up to any social challenges that we face. And I believe it is this strength and hope that we have to encourage in one another and inspire in each other. Because collectively, we can contribute to a greater sense of hope. And because our small acts of resistance and the small examples like Mbasri's can help us see that sometimes the impossible is possible. Thank you.